Our text this morning is from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1 to 10. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1 to 10. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This is the word of the Lord. As we work our way to the end of 2 Corinthians, we are continuing in a series of strange sermons, and this morning is no exception. It looks like I need to break another one of those standard preaching rules. I've broken a lot of them over the last couple of weeks. Going to do that again this morning. Our preaching teachers always tell us that if something isn't very clear in your own mind before you preach it, it's almost impossible to preach it clearly to your audience. If it's muddled in your head, it's going to be muddled on your lips, and it's going to be muddled when people hear it. Now, you've heard me preaching for enough years by now that you know that I strive for clarity. You know how I approach this. I spend a lot of time looking at the text, looking very carefully, word by word, to be sure that it's clear and that you understand all the key words and all the important terms used in the text. And we look at the Greek and the Hebrew together to make sure we understand all the words. But regrettably, this morning, there are 2 words, 2 important ideas at the heart of our text that are pretty unclear. 2 ideas that we're unsure about, and that have both given scholars and commentators a great deal of trouble. Now, when preachers hit something that's unclear in the text, they either ignore it and pretend it's not there and hope you won't notice, or they just kind of briefly mention it, trying not to trip over it. But believe it or not, those 2 unclear words that we're unsure about are actually going to be the 2 key points in today's sermon. You see, I really have no choice, because these 2 unclear points in the text are actually at the heart of the argument that Paul's making in the text, so I can't pretend they're not there. The 2 ideas that we need to wrestle with today are the strange vision, this revelation, this out-of-body experience that Paul had, and the other one is this thorn in the flesh that he wrestled with. Let's talk about the vision for a moment. One of the reasons why it's hard to be exact about Paul's vision is that there are some things about it that he's not clear about himself. He isn't quite sure, for example, whether this was, out of the body or in the body experience. Some commentators have suggested that on one of those several occasions when Paul was very severely beaten, that maybe he had a near-death experience and his soul sort of left his body. You might recall there was one point, Paul mentions it a couple of weeks ago, there was one point where they stoned him and they left him for dead. He was in such bad shape, they couldn't find a pulse. They thought he was gone. And Paul speaks about carrying the death of Jesus in his body. So some commentators wonder, maybe that's what happened. Maybe at one of those moments where Paul was beaten so severely and left for dead, maybe he slipped to the other side for a few moments. I mean, after all, Paul does use the word paradise, and he talks about the third heaven. Now, there's a couple problems with this theory. Now, granted, Paul uses these two strange words. He talks about paradise and about the third heaven. But the word paradise is a little bit problematic in the Scriptures. We've got to be careful not to equate the paradise with heaven the way we conceive heaven necessarily. The word doesn't appear often in the Scriptures, just a handful of times. And both in the Old Testament Hebrew and in the New Testament Greek, it's actually not even a Hebrew or Greek word. It's sort of a loan word from the Old Persian. In Hebrew, it's most frequently used to talk about the Garden of Eden as a paradise. So not heaven, but some really cool place here on earth. In fact, in the Septuagint and the Greek version of the Old Testament, it uses paradise to speak specifically of the Garden of Eden. Now, over time in the Jewish canonical writings, including the writings written by the community of Qumran, and these are many of the documents we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they thought of a garden paradise as the place where God's presence was, here on the earth or on the other side. And this word for paradise took on sort of the mystical, secret garden type of place. The Romans believed that when they died, they would meet the gods. If they had lived their life well, they would meet the gods in some kind of a paradise. It was a garden. They called them the Elysian Fields, the concept which the French seized with full force when they named that large avenue in Paris with all of its retail and entertainment attractions. You know what it's called, the main street in Paris. It's called Les Champs-Élysées, the garden paradise to which we hope to go after we die. Now, between you and I hope and pray that when we get to heaven, we don't find ourselves on a busy commercial street in France, clogged with traffic, lined with Louis Vuitton stores and Gucci shops, and overpriced, snooty French restaurants selling frog's legs and stuff like this. One of the most important clues is that after using the term paradise, Paul speaks not about heaven, but about the third heaven. Now, this was a common expression, not to speak of the place we hope to go after death, but to speak of some kind of state of ecstasy. In French, we sometimes use the expression seventh heaven in the same way. You taste some great cooking, or you see a beautiful piece of art, or your spouse makes you really happy, and you find yourself au septième ciel, in seventh heaven, in sheer delight. So Paul's use of third heaven suggests that he wasn't thinking that he had left this world and gone on to the next. And if Paul had thought that he was in heaven in some way, he would have known that he was no longer in his body. He doesn't seem to know whether he's still in the body or not. Most importantly, however, in a number of his letters, Paul spends a lot of time talking about the resurrection and convincing people about the reality and the importance of the next life, that after we die, there's something else. And if he hadn't been there in this out-of-body experience, you can be sure that Paul would have talked openly about it. He spends so much time convincing people that there's a resurrection life that if he had been there, he would have clearly talked about it. Now, in recent years, there have been a number of books published by people who claim that they've visited heaven in some kind of sensational near-death or after-death experience. There's a little boy that had an accident in a playground, and he claims that he was in heaven for a while, and he met Jesus and his grandfather. There's been several books like this. And in the end, all of them have been discredited, often by the authors themselves, who eventually admitted that they made up the whole story. Regrettably, even this little boy whose story was made into a movie. Now, in the interim, of course, they sell a lot of books and they've made a lot of money. I would take their contrition and their apologies a little more seriously if after they admitted it was a lie, they returned all the royalties they made on the books and the movies that they sold, but they never seem to do that. It's a little convenient. No, God could certainly confirm the truth of heaven. If there was a heaven, an afterlife, and God wanted to, I don't want to say if, I believe there is, if God wanted to confirm to us that there was, why doesn't he send more people back from the other side? Why doesn't he allow this to happen? People who've died, who've gone to the other side, and who come back as reliable witnesses to tell us what it's like. Well, there is one. There is one who died. In fact, he was dead for 3 days, and he came back to life. He came back to life not only to tell us what it's like, but also to make sure that we can get there with him and with the Father when the time comes. And he assures us, those of us who believe in him, that we don't have to worry about the other side because he's gone on ahead to prepare a place for us in the glory of the Father's presence. Now, I admit, like everybody else, that I'm a little curious about what it's like. Will we play baseball on the other side? Will we follow the World Cup tournament on the other side? Will there be good cerveza? But the Bible gives us only one clear detail about the other side, and that's enough to make me want to be there. When I go there, he will be there. The one who's gone on ahead to prepare. He's going to be there. This one who has loved me so much that he opened the way for me through his death and resurrection, he will be there, and I want to be with him. That's all I need to know. And in fact, in the shortest, most succinct statements that Paul makes about heaven, Paul gives us just these most important details. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says this, we're always of good courage. We know that while we're at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. If we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. If you're a believer, that's all you need to know about the other side. When the moment comes, when you slip to the other side, you're going to be at home with the Lord. In Philippians 1, he explains it this way, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. Whatever is good about this life, whatever you enjoy on this side, whatever gives you pleasure and joy and fulfillment, it's nothing compared to what's on the other side, because there, all the joys will be there, compounded with the presence of Christ. Paul is so taken with the thought of being in the presence of Jesus Christ when he goes to the other side into the next life. He's so anxious to finally taste the presence of Christ that if Paul had been there, if Paul had left this world and slipped to the other side in the presence of Jesus Christ, there is no doubt in his description of the experience that he would have talked front and center about the person of Jesus Christ. And he doesn't. So it doesn't sound like the vision that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 12 is some kind of near-death experience where he slipped over to the other side. As Paul writes about this vision, he's still carrying this long train of thought, this countering the boasting of the fake apostles. You remember the fake apostles that come to Corinth, and they were bragging about all the wonderful stuff they could do. And they tried everything they could to discredit Paul when they arrived. Said, that Paul, he's a weakling. He's got no energy when he preaches. He's sick all the time. He's poor and he's destitute. That's not what you'd expect from a servant of God. And he's not really Jewish. He's not really Hebrew enough. He wasn't even born in Jerusalem. He didn't grow up in Israel. How Jewish can he be? They tried everything to discredit Paul and to push their own credibility, to argue that they were better than him. And one of the things about themselves that they used to show how superior they were to Paul, they boasted that they had these visions and these supernatural experiences. Now, that wasn't unusual in the Jewish world. The Jewish writings themselves confirm that throughout much of the history of Judaism, there's been this undertow of mysticism and visions and dreams and euphoric manifestations. Even before Jesus came, during the moment of silence between the two testaments, there were people who were claiming to have all of these impressive visions. Now, the same kind of things happened in pagan temples. In Corinth, all around the Christians, in these temples dedicated to all of these other deities and goddesses, there were people who would go into trances. They would take drugs and hallucinogens, and they would drink and have these wild sexual encounters, and they would go into these trances, and they would even speak in tongues. And they were quite excited when they heard these fake apostles who had these weird visions and dreams. Wow, we have these too. It seemed like everybody was having these visions and these wild, excited, everybody but Paul. So Paul says, look. Okay. Just want to be clear. You guys have visions? I've had visions. You want to talk about visions? You want to compare visions? I've had visions that would leave yours in the dust, okay? I mean, I met Jesus in visions, and he revealed stuff to me. Now, this is a little startling because, we don't think of Paul as the guy to have these wild, excited visions. I mean, Paul's this level-headed guy. He doesn't do weird stuff like this. I mean, you read the Apostle Paul, and he sounds like John Calvin and Martin Luther, who studied law, and they were lawyers. And Paul writes Romans like a law treatise, like he's about to present it before the Supreme Court of Corinth of Rome. And there's this logical flow to his letters. Paul is level-headed and rational. Paul doesn't sound like the kind of guy who would have these wild mystical experiences, and he almost never speaks about them. In a dozen epistles that he's written, almost a third of the New Testament, there's only a small handful of places where Paul mentions experiences like this. And there's a reason for that. Paul knows that these wild, ecstatic experiences, they don't prove anything. People all over the world doing all kinds of things, some of them completely illegal, many of them gravely dangerous, also have all kinds of weird, ecstatic experiences. From the drug-induced trances of the LSD generations decades ago, where I and my parents grew up, to the excited, dizzying trances of the whirling dervishes centuries before. It's funny, 2 centuries ago, one of the first explorers to encounter those who lived in the far Canadian north, this happened right here in the Canadian Arctic, in his journals, he gets to these little remote, distant communities, and they're experimenting with mushrooms and stuff that they found, and he heard them speaking in tongues in the Canadian Arctic in the 17 and 1800s. Well, Paul simply states that he too had moments like this. He appeared to be lost in some kind of ecstasy before God. He's had those moments, but he doesn't major on them. He realizes that they can easily be counterfeited. And if I have a wild experience in a dream this morning where God spoke to me, well, maybe tomorrow my neighbor has a wild experience and his lampshade speaks to him. Or the battery in his car has a conversation. So we have these private moments. But there are a couple of things that we know about Paul's vision that set it apart. His choice of wording is most interesting. He doesn't just use the word vision. He insists on using the word revelation. And the term revelation is repeatedly used throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament to speak not so much about things that you see, but about things that you hear. These are expressions about words, about language, about clear, audible things. And it's reinforced by the way Paul says, doesn't say, I saw things that I can't tell you about. He says, I heard things that I can't repeat. So Paul says it's not like, Ezekiel the prophet, he saw spinning things and wild creatures coming and going, or John, he sees these images and these pictures and he tries to describe them in words, and there's crystal cities and glass and all kinds of things that he can't quite describe in words. Paul heard words, he was told things, some things which he wasn't allowed to repeat, and some things which he was told to share and to teach. It's also very significant, I think, that Paul is very lucid about the time and the place when this happened. 14 years ago, he says. If we do the math right, this would have been around the time when Paul was in Arabia. We talked about this together a little bit several weeks ago. After his dramatic conversion on the Damascus Road, Paul retires in solitude for a couple of years before his ministry begins. During this time, the Lord appeared to him several times and revealed a number of things to him, including some insights Paul had about the events in the upper room that he didn't get from the other apostles. You remember in 1 Corinthians 11, I received from the Lord what I delivered to you, that on the night the Lord Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and wine. He doesn't say Peter and John and James told me what happened in the upper room. He says the Lord told me this directly. At first glance, it seems strange that Paul would mention this vision, this revelation, without going into details. It's certainly not what you would expect. I'm always amazed when they announce the death of somebody famous, as they did this weekend. Christopher Plummer passed away. I don't know if the younger ones know who Christopher Plummer is. I don't even know if you've seen The Sound of Music. You know The Sound of Music? Okay, nothing, fine, okay. Before your time, sorry. Christopher Plummer is the good-looking, handsome young guy, And you know what the funny, the same thing happens. Every time somebody famous like that passes away, everybody comes out of the woodwork, and it's like, oh yeah, I knew him, he was like a friend, they make it sound like they were the celebrity's best friend, and they're always over at their house, and on a first-name basis, calling each other on the phone. And over the last couple of days in radio phone-in shows, people have called in talking about Christopher Plummer, and, but then when they tell their story, it turns out that, they had a friend whose aunt was married to a guy who was the cousin of the other man who lived 3 streets over across the railroad track in the next village from where the movie star's car driver lived. It's like... Now, these false apostles who were teaching these heresies, they were boasting. They were boasting, among other things, that they had these visions. Well, I've seen things, and they were miraculous things, and they were wild stuff, and I saw this firsthand, but there was no substance to it. Paul says, you want to talk about visions? Nobody has more to boast about than me. But I didn't just get wild, ecstatic visions. There was a revelation of truth that God entrusted to me. I saw and I heard the real thing. And it was important to affirm that revelation because it was the heart of Paul's teaching. It affirmed his authority as an apostle to teach what he taught on Christ's behalf. But along with the revelation came something else, says Paul. In our English translation, Paul calls it a thorn in the flesh. Now, if you've ever worked with wood, you just hear the word and you can feel the pain. Got a workshop at home and work with wood. And one of the styles these days is to use recovered barnwood. So you don't work with brand new, smooth pieces of wood that have already been cut and sanded for you. These days the style is you work with barnwood. So you take these old pieces of wood and lumber and timber that come from old barns and old buildings, and you take them and you make shelves and stuff out of them. And the problem with that wood is it's really rough. You want to know how rough it is? I got about 4 or 5 holes still in some of my fingers from some of the splinters. So I hear the word thorn and I'm in pain already. The Greek word is interesting. It's the word scallops, not scallops like potatoes, scallops. And it's a word for a sharp needle-like thing. Among other things, it's used to describe the tail, the stinging tail of a scorpion. The sharp, that's a scallop, the scorpion scallop. It's often used of the wood splinter, the kind that breaks off and just kind of lodges under your skin, and it's under there and you can't quite pull it out, and it's painful, and it's also the word that's used, interestingly, for a stake of wood that's driven in the ground. When you pitch your tent and you have a guy wire and you want the tent not to fly away, you use a sharp stake of wood, you drive it into the ground, and you'll tie a wire to it so that your tent doesn't fly away. And I think that's the sense in which Paul is using it, because it develops this interesting image. In verse 7, when he says that he had such a great revelation that God was worried that he would be conceited, the word conceited there is the word for flying away, to be airborne. Paul says the revelation he'd had was so great, was so unbelievable, he was so privileged, it was so important, this revelation that he had, that God knew there was a risk that Paul would be floating about 10 feet off the ground. He was going to be airborne. He was going to take off because he was so important, because he'd had such a great revelation, just buoyed by his own self-importance. So along with the revelation, Paul says, God gave me a stake, threw a stake in the ground, tied a string to it, and tied me down so my feet would stay on the ground. One of the things I like about Montreal is that there's all kinds of festivals. Whatever you like, you can find a festival for it. Whether it's jazz or comedy or poutine, there's a festival for everything in Montreal. Just wait and it'll come. You like knitting with cat fur, there'll be a festival for that soon. Just hang on, it'll be there. In the month of August every year on the South Shore, I think they skipped it last year because of COVID, but most years in the month of August in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, there's a hot air balloon festival. And there's a place there on the military grounds where they take off, and then they follow the river, these hot air balloons. You can see dozens, and sometimes there's enough of them, you can even see them from Montreal. And if you've ever been there, there's something neat that happens. They fill the balloon with air, and then they got to heat up that air so it's lighter than the air around it. So they light a little kerosene thing, and it heats the air. And as the air in the balloon starts to take shape, and then it starts to rise, and then it starts to lift off the ground. But they want to make sure it doesn't take off before you're ready, and so they use stakes in the ground with ropes tied to it to keep the balloon down from taking off. That's the image that Paul uses. There's a risk that this great revelation might let him get carried away with himself to get airborne. So God gives him this stake, this thorn, driven into the ground to anchor him, reminding him, Paul, you had a great revelation, but you know what? You're a human being. You put your pant legs on one at a time in the morning. You're a mere mortal like the rest of us. And you need to walk with humility. Now, I told you there are two great unknowns in our text this morning. And the first one is that we don't quite know what this vision or this revelation was, this out-of-body experience that Paul had. We don't quite know what it is. It was important to Paul. It was revelation of truth. It was significant. The second thing that we don't know, though, is what this thorn was. Here again, scholars and commentators have dozens of varying opinions. What was this thorn that God gave Paul? In the book of Romans at one point, Paul talks about how hard it is as a Christian to do the right thing. God wants you to lead a godly life, to live purity and holiness, and it's hard to do that because there's all these temptations. And you struggle, and you keep trying to live a good life, but you keep slipping, and you do okay for a couple days, and you slip again, and you do, and some people say that maybe that's what Paul was struggling with. Maybe there was some sin in Paul's life. Maybe there was some sensual temptation that he could never quite get completely over. And that was his thorn that kept reminding him that he was human. Now, I don't think this fits. And I'll tell you why I don't think this fits. If you've been there, if you've ever struggled with a repetitive sin that you're trying to get over, that you're trying to deal with, that you're trying to master and control, I'm willing to bet you prayed about it more than 3 times. Try 1,000 times. How many hundreds of times did you pray, Lord, watch my tongue. Lord, don't let me lose my temper. Lord, don't let me watch those shows on TV. Lord, why do I, when I have 2 beers, 3 beers, can I help me? I've got this smoke. I'm willing to bet if you struggle with anything like that, you've prayed 3 times an hour. Just in the text in the book of Romans where Paul struggles with this thing, just in that chapter, he prays more than 3 times about it. So I don't think this is it. Judging by the details we have about Paul in other texts, we know that there are great physical health challenges that Paul faced. At one point when he was going up into Macedonia, into upper regions of Asia Minor, he had to cross through the Taurus Mountains. And there's just one narrow mountain pass that you can take to get through the Taurus Mountains. And the problem is the terrain in there is very swampy and it's infested with bugs that give you malaria. When Paul was on his way through there to get up to Macedonia, he got malaria. He had migraine headaches. His vision was weakening. Now, those of you who have chronic migraines, you know how debilitating this can be. You get one of those migraines, you can't think, can't listen to music, can't have a conversation, can't pray, can't sleep. It's just paralyzing. Combined with eyesight problems that would have made it hard for Paul to read and write and do some of the basic things, you can imagine how this would have repeatedly reminded Paul of just how human he was. You might be a great disciple, you might be a great apostle, you might have founded lots of churches, but you know what? You're a human being. And when your head hurts, migraine's there. Maybe there was a physical illness that Paul struggled with. Maybe this was his thorn in the flesh that kept reminding that in spite of all the great things he could do for God, he was still a human being. This would certainly fit the idea. If you've had a thorn in the flesh, if you've got a thorn there that you can't pull out, causing you constant pain, slowing you down as you do everything else, you know what it's like. A couple of scholars have thought that maybe Paul was struggling with some psychological issues, mental health issues. In some personal comments that slip in through his letters, some have seen the telltale signs of deep depression that Paul struggled with at several times in his ministry. We don't know a lot about Paul's personal life. We know a couple of things about his marital status. In order to be a member of the Sanhedrin, as Paul was when he started in the faith, you had to be married. So at some point, Paul had been married, but he was alone now. Given his views on divorce, we don't think he was divorced. We think he was widowed. We think he had been married, likely married without children, and he had lost this wife. He'd lost this woman. He'd lost her early enough that they had not had children together. So some scholars have tried to get their heads around what it was like for Paul to have once been in love, once been married, to have lost this woman to an early death, to illness or disease or an accident, and then to travel alone, no wife, no children, no extended family, and then going on alone in solitary, difficult circumstances, not just traveling without family, but without close connections, without anybody to come home to. And then the emotional hurt of everybody who's upset at you, the churches talking behind your back, the churches who should be caring for you and aren't, the churches who turn on you and accuse you of all kinds of weird things, who slander you behind your back. Now, if you've struggled with anything like this, you know that, well, you break a leg, you can put it in a splinter and eventually it heals. Migraine can hurt a lot, but it's nothing compared to the aching pain of this ongoing emotional trauma and this loneliness that you carry all the time. Some people think maybe that was Paul's thorn in the flesh. It could have been any of the things. It could have been a physical thing, could have been something in his head. Paul doesn't tell us. We do know this, that Paul prayed 3 times that God would remove it. Does that sound familiar? Just like the Lord, that difficult night before his death, he's with the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he sees this cup of suffering that's coming. He knows what's coming for him. And 3 times he prays that God would remove it. Some scholars have suggested that there's a parallel there that's intentional. And that what Paul was struggling with is the sure thought that his life wouldn't be long. You remember Martin Luther King Jr. does this thing just a couple days before his death, one of his last public address. He says, "You're going to get to the promised land. I might not get there with you." He had a sense that the end was near. Paul had that throughout the last of his epistles that he wrote. And some people think that the thorn that Paul carried that reminded him of how human he was, of how limited he was that he knew his life wouldn't be long. He was that sick, he was that ill, and he was facing such brutal persecution and suffering that he knew that he didn't have a lot of years left. Whatever Paul's thorn was, however earnestly he prayed that it would be removed, the Lord's answer to Paul is a powerful one that strikes at the reality of our everyday lives. God says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Take this away, Lord. Take this away. No, you're going to keep this. In your weakness, you'll know my power. It's funny, when we first approach the ministry as new pastors, we all do the same thing. At least I think we all do the same thing. You start with your first church. It's your first pastorate. And you have this mental inventory of all your great strengths and all your great skills, of all the things that you can do really well. And you imagine you're going to get to this church, and they're going to realize how wonderful you are, and they're going to be impressed and overcome by your great shining abilities, and you're going to work wonders, and this church soon will have 3,000 members, and you've got all these things in your head. And soon we discover the brutal reality that God most often uses us in our weakness and not in our strength. And I think this happens for several reasons. Some people are so convinced that they're so good, that they have such great skills, and they're so conceited about it that they've left the ground, and they're no earthly good. They're unapproachable. They float 10 feet off the ground away from anybody else, and nobody can relate to them. And it turns out that the things they thought were great strengths don't help them. They hinder them because they distance them from the people they're supposed to be serving. And then God has to cut them down to size, remind them that they're human beings. God drives a stake in the ground, and he ties a rope to your left ankle so you don't get airborne. And he says, "You know what? Welcome to the human race." And when that happens, when you realize that in spite of all your best efforts, in spite of everything you learned in seminary, in spite of everything you thought you were really good at, you keep coming up short, and you can't do it on your own, and you realize how dependent you are on God, you're driven to your knees, and you start looking for help. And it's when you finally start looking for help, it's when you finally have no choice but to turn to God and depend on His strength and His empowering, that's when stuff starts to happen, because it's happening on His strength, not on how good you think you are. I can't tell you how often God has done this very thing in our lives for Debbie and I as we've ministered. You know that Debbie and I have struggled with our inability to have children. This has been one of our great struggles, one of our deepest sorrows. And yet how often we've been able to minister to others in their hurt and in their loss and in their feeling of emptiness because we've been there, because we know what this is like. To have this one thing that you dream about, that you want, that you assume, that just never happens. And what I bring to the table as a pastor at those moments of pain, it's not deep biblical insight or great preaching ability or some magical words that can take the hurt away and solve everything. I come to the table as a heartbroken, completely powerless husband who has wept with his wife at this inexplicable loss, at this gut-wrenching longing that's never fulfilled, no matter how hard you pray. And in that moment of weakness, all I have to offer is the grace of the Lord. I served in a congregation with several fellow elders that I respected a great deal. Several of them were very well off financially. 2 or 3 of them were CEOs in large corporations that you've heard about. There are a couple of doctors in there. They all had large fancy houses in nice neighborhoods and very successful nice cars and summer cottages, and they took the wild trips with their wives and all the stuff you expect. And in contrast, there I was a struggling salesman most of my life, living on commission, eking out a living, good months and bad months, and sometimes there was, too much month left at the end of the money. Once, because of a business trouble in one of the businesses we worked with, we came near a bankruptcy. But the funny thing is, the people in the congregation who were struggling with their finances, who wanted to pray with somebody, who wanted some help, they kept coming to me for advice and for help. And I kept saying, why don't you go to, this guy, he's a CEO at an airline. Why don't you go to, he's a doctor, he's doing well, he's got money. Why don't you go? And they said, no. They have no idea what it's like when you've lost your job and you're not sure you can buy groceries. I'm coming to you because I know that you know what that's like. As I went through Presbyterian college preparing for ordained ministry, there are some things that came naturally to me because I'd done them before. The preaching and the planning and the administration and the budget, I can handle some of that stuff. I've done it before. Confession time. Praying is always the struggle for me. It still is. And then having to figure out this Presbyterian thing that you do, that you write out your prayers. I'd never done this before. How can you write out a prayer? How Christian is this to you? And then I found myself having to lead prayer meetings and to pray in the hospital and to pray in liturgy several times. And I got to tell you, this doesn't come naturally to me. This is a deep part of the struggle. I had to look to the Lord. I know some of you are saying, okay, Coppieters, keep working at it because you're not really good at praying yet. Okay, I understand. I realize. But because I feel inadequate, I turn to other people. I turn to the prayers that others have written. I turn to some of the great prayers in the scriptures and the Psalms. And I need the help because I'm out of my comfort zone. And the weird thing that happens, I've got this little prayer journal that I keep. I started my 4th one at the beginning of January since I've been here in 2012. And I got to tell you, you look through the margins in the prayers, the things that we've prayed together, there's a bunch of little check marks. All the answers we've had to prayer since I've been here in 2012. And it's funny because I don't think I do this well. I struggle with this. I have to keep this journal. I keep this. And yet God is responding and God is answering prayers. And the reason that's happening is because I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm in completely over my head. I have no idea how to do this. And I'm trying to learn as I go along with you. And it's at those moments that God responds. At those moments where we realize we're helpless. And if it's going to happen, it's going to be by his power. Therefore, says Paul, I boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, because when I am weak, then I am strong. In a few moments, we're going to celebrate communion together. And that principle will be reinforced so strongly as we come together around the cross of Christ. There's an old Amy Grant song that says it so well. It says this: God's greatest work was done in the frailty of his Son. From the human perspective, in apparent weakness, in the limitations of a bruised, broken, pained, bleeding human body, in the suffering and the calamity of the cross, being executed like a common criminal, God breaks the power of sin. He abolishes death, and he redeems the world in this moment of apparent weakness and suffering. His greatest work. So you and I, we have dreams of ministry. We offer ourselves to God because we want to shine. We want to be well known and respected. We want to have a great ministry that everybody recognizes. We want to succeed and be popular. We want to have the accolades for our abilities. But God wants to display in us the power of Christ. The power that speaks through weakness, in suffering, in brokenness, and in pain. The power that sacrifices self to see the work of God done. And his name alone is glorified, and Christ is exalted. In the middle of these challenging days of COVID, we feel restricted, limited, completely powerless against this tiny microscopic virus that we can't even see. God has cut us down to size. He's certainly shown us who's boss, and it's not us. In our lives, as the challenges mount and as we crumble and tremble before the obstacles that we would never even have dreamed of a year ago, as we approach the changes that may come in the General Assembly this year in the Presbyterian Church, changes that may have dramatic consequences for us, we feel like we've been thrown about by the wind in these large sweep of inevitable unfolding historical changes. In all this, we feel overwhelmed. We feel small and unequal to the task. We feel our weakness and our inability and our need for wisdom. But you know what? When we are weak, then we are strong, because his grace is sufficient and his power is made perfect in our weakness. For it is when we know that we can't handle this alone, it's when we realize that we can't fix this, it's when we know that we finally have to give up on ourselves and we turn to him and we seek his wisdom and his guidance and his power, that's when stuff happens. So courage, my friends. We have not even begun to see what great things God can do through the power of Christ, revealed in people like us, needy and broken, but wholly committed to him and entirely dependent on his power and his power alone. May it be so. Amen and amen.